Hello, everybody. Give me just a second to sort out my water bottle situation here so that I'm not fumbling with that. Is this also working? Cool. Okay, clicker in hand. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Mira Fisher, presenting on this paper by myself and my co-author, Stephen Ware. So, narrative planning is really useful if you want to model story structure in a precise way. It offers centralized plot control that also reasons about characters' intentions, which also allows it to identify narrative features like conflict and to generate stories specifically targeting experiences like suspense. These, and already the water. These plan structures also have value for predicting audience comprehension of a story. And narrative planning has been suggested as the basis for a more complete model of narrative sense-making in general. However, reasoning about characters' plans is expensive, especially when those plans may consider other characters' plans as well, which can limit these planners to working with small or abstract stories. As it stands, authors working with larger or more complex stories must develop abstractions that make the stories more manageable. But this is a difficult, error-prone task even for experienced authors. For example, in one of our projects, we have been working to develop a virtual reality de-escalation training simulation that encourages best practices by reacting to player actions in deliberate ways. Police training is a high-stakes context, and we feel that the centralized control and verifiable reasoning that narrative planning offers is critical for teaching the right lessons. However, narrative planning cannot be applied directly in this complex virtual environment, and a more abstract representation is required. But integration between these two layers is a tricky task to get right. So, if we could start from a model of the system at a low level, could we automate the rest of the process? It isn't without precedent. There's a lot of work investigating automated methods of abstraction for solving planning problems. Here, I want to draw a distinction between methods that are incorporated into a planner in a supporting role, such as providing heuristics to guide search, and those which commit more completely to the approach, doing things like decomposing the problem and solving it in parts. Methods in the latter category present difficulties for automated planning that have limited their overall success and adoption in the community. Essentially, detail lost in the abstraction process can cause it to miss the best plans, and the time it takes to identify the subproblems can waste any gains you were going to get. But we shouldn't be too worried about this because narrative planning is really different. The narrative context has different priorities for performance and, sorry, let me restart that. Narrative planning builds on the automated planning methods and representations, but the narrative context enforces different priorities. Narrative planning is more concerned with producing coherent and reasonable stories than short ones, and so there may be more room for tolerating inefficient plans, and since there is no definitive best story, a narrative planner is more likely to be called upon to produce story after story rather than just once. So upfront efforts to make the producing process faster will have increasing gains. With these differences in mind, we propose that abstraction in this context should be considered in terms of its ability to reduce the complexity of the problem, retain information useful for evaluating narrative features, and the potential for introducing error to low-level plans, rather than just how fast does it help us get this one plan out. There is a lot of work related to automated abstraction in planning. For the sake of brevity, I will focus on the most directly related areas. Please see the paper for more detail. So abstraction hierarchy planners like HighPoint solve a problem by finding a solution in the abstract space then working down through less abstract versions until you get to the original problem and it just works. The abstractions themselves are straightforward. Keep some variables, ignore the rest. This results in what gets called a projection of the problem onto a simpler state space. Our approach identifies an abstract problem hierarchically related to the original, but the state space is determined from interactions between projections rather than using the projections themselves. Projections are a common method of abstraction in planning and very beneficial in how simple they are. However, the merge and shrink framework supports the definition of more complex abstractions like our work. And like our work, this involves merging projections while retaining complete information about the possible states, and then applying a transformation that discards some of that information. This is the shrink in merge and shrink, and our method, we also do this shrink from merge and shrink. I just wasn't aware of merge and shrink before the paper. A reviewer wonderfully helped with that. But our method of discarding information is new. Decoupled search simplifies a problem by partitioning the state variables such that there is a central projection and some number of simpler leaves. Leaves are selected such that the changes in one leaf will never directly affect others. This allows the possible leaf states to be considered exhaustively, decoupled from the branching search in the center. We also partition the problem, but not in a way that defines a center, and we exhaustively consider states for every projection, but use the interactions to determine the abstraction in the end. Finally, we want to note the fast downward planner as a point of inspiration. The translation component, which uses multi-value variables to express the possible states of related literals in a propositional problem, is conceptually related to our approach, and their use of transition graphs inspired ours. So, to lay it out more clearly, we start with a multi-value planning problem, meaning that each variable draws from a finite set of values that may have many options, though the variables only have one value at a time. We partition the set of all these variables into groups, which we then think of as subproblems, and for each of these, we identify every combination of values that might be assigned to those variables, and what it takes to go between them. Then we track the way that changing between these partial states in one subproblem might interact with other subproblems, which allows us to remove the details that are only internally relevant. Rather than a complex VR simulation, we experimented with this approach using an adaptation of the Save Grandma narrative planning problem you may be familiar with. Adapting this into a single player, like a single agent grid-based RPG. This allows movement in the cardinal directions and simple actions like holding an item or swinging a sword, and only these low-level movements. Considering this, we wonder how can we go from these low-level variables, like the ones tracking row and column positions, to something more abstract. One intuition behind our approach is shown here. The player can move to many states across the grid, but only the ones shown in red really interact with the rest of the things you can do. But let's consider something a little smaller so we can look at it in detail. Here at the bottom is the player, who we call Tom. He can move in cardinal directions unless the grid square he would move to is occupied. So he can't move to this space, which is occupied by his grandma's cottage, or this space occupied by the merchant. When he's next to the merchant, he can enter a trade by selecting an item to buy, which means if he moves away and ends the trade without paying, he'll be considered a thief. But the planner doesn't understand this map. It models the game, but it doesn't know what it is modeling. Instead, it has variables like the one representing Tom's column position, which we'll call X. This variable can be changed, but only in specific ways that depend on other parts of the problem, such as the variable representing Tom's row position, which we'll call Y. To better understand a variable like this, we will graph the ways that it changes, labeling these transitions with how they depend on the rest of the problem. For example, X can be changed from 0 to 1 if Tom is alive, which is represented here by A, and y is 0. We can also change x from 1 to 0 under the same conditions, but they may have additional effects depending on if Tom owes the merchant money or not. Which is marked with those letters there, but to keep the example clear, I'm only going to think about the y's and such. And I will use colors instead of those, which leads us to having a very colorful graph with a lot of these transitions. But like I said, the planner doesn't know about the map. It only knows how these variables can change. And in such a low-level environment with many small changes, these graphs get very complicated. But a lot of this complication comes from tracking how these two variables interact. What if we model them both at the same time? This gives us these 9 states to consider instead of the 6 in the 2 different graphs, but now the transitions are much simpler. We still have the complicated interactions with theft, but otherwise they only require that Tom's alive. Also, looking at the transitions, it becomes clear that we only have 7 states to consider, not 9. Now, recall that we colored the individual graphs to track external dependencies. An unfortunately colorful proposition in this case, since each state enables different things. We can do this again for the combined graph, which are what all the transitions which require knowing about what the x and y values were must now depend on. This time I get to spare your eyes because we only need these 3 colors for all 7 states. Other parts of the problem may require that Tom's next to the merchant or his grandma's cottage, but that's it. And since all external problems work the same, whether one is in state 1, 0 or 2, 1, those states might as well both have the value m for adjacent to merchant. And the others can be marked with G for adjacent to grandma's cottage and E for everywhere else. Which at this point, we might as well just say there's 3 states. We call these groups of same-colored states regions. Their main role is indicating what internal details can be hidden. In the abstract problem we generate, the variables represent subproblems, and the values of those variables are the representations of these subproblem regions. The abstract operators, it's harder to describe exactly how this is done concisely, but essentially it's just what's needed to model the transitions that are still in the graph with all the additional details. Now, merging these variables like this is a balancing act. The more you consider at the same time, the more detail you might be able to remove, but if you remove too many, they may get too large and not tell you much anyway. Merging everything would just give you the graph of all the states in the problem, and the regions would just be goal reached or goal not reached. For now, we determined groupings manually. We grouped variables with a lot of mutual dependency, like you saw with x and y, and we also grouped ones that led to a lot of partial states due to constraints like the merchant's hit points can't change until Tom has their sword. Also, variables which served a similar function for the rest of the problem, like the position of the 2 different coins. To gauge the reduction in information, we compared the size of the full state space for the abstract problem against the size of the original. We also note the number of unique endings here. We also have here the number of partial states expanded for all subproblem graphs and the total number of regions identified from this. So if you recall from the example, this has 7 partial states, 3 regions. The GG base entry here corresponds to how it looks with all the variables still in separate groups. The abstract problem for this does already reduce things due to factoring out changes in health values. The GG adjacent entry here is basically the scaled up version of what I showed you in the example. The number of partial states jumps up since each position Tom can stand gets represented directly, and it jumps up quite a bit, but the count of regions drops quite a bit too, since the rest of the problem only checks who he's standing next to. This is basically the ideal case. It's a highly independent subproblem with a limited set of ways that it connects to the rest. And as a result, it's about 25 times smaller. Removing the specifics of position also reduces the number of endings that look unique, since some only look different because Tom was south of grandma instead of west of grandma. The next few groups brought together variables closely related to each character, with Tom and the merchant together, since the relationship between the two hinges on the merchant's sword, and in the end, the abstract state was less than 2% of the original size. We also reduced the length of plans, since we collapse a bunch of like grid movements and changes in health into just you go from they're not dead to they are now dead. And this reduces the length of plans. The shortest plan to heal grandma is 28 steps in the low level, 6 in the abstract. So this is the method with a lot of promise for moving large amounts of low-level information that isn't relevant outside of a specific subproblem. This can drive big reductions in the state space, particularly if you have these highly separate subproblems, that in turn can reduce the length of plans. Also, identifying and removing the information that's only relevant inside subproblems can tell you about what endings are similar. Moving forward, we want to experiment with approaches to picking these groups automatically and to improve the operator abstraction so that we can summarize stories further. We expect that incorporating character goals will be a big role in this, especially as it comes to taking this from single agent to multi-agent. And the big thing is we used a synthetic domain for experimenting with this so that we had a clear impression of what the abstract version would look like, but we really, really want to do this in more domains. By the way, if you have one that you think might fit the bill for this kind of thing, please let me know in a break or by email or something, because they're far and few in between. Anyway, all done. Any questions?